Next, we'll be hearing from Dr. Ecoee Rooney. Yes, the same one that you just heard in our wonderful relaxation meditation video. Dr. Rooney is a leader in trauma-informed care and equity-focused nursing education. Her work has advanced how healthcare organizations can better understand and respond to the compounded impact of race and trauma on both patients and the workforce. In today's presentation, Serving at the Intersection of Race and Trauma, Dr. Rooney will give us an examining on how race and trauma intersect and how these forces shape our lived experiences for both providers and patients, and how we as leaders can respond with compassion, resilience, and justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ecoee Rooney.
Thank you so much, Claire and Lisa. This has been such an amazing morning so far, and I'm delighted that a lot of the things that I'm going to share have to do with very much these same, hopefully really dovetail well with some of the things that you've already heard. Let me share my screen. That will take just a second. I hope that all of you have received the words as deeply as I have from this morning's presentation. So I want to make sure that I am sharing my presentation. So hopefully you see that. And we are talking about serving at the intersection of race and trauma. This is kind of an expansion of a program that I gave several years ago as part of a Healthy Louisiana initiative in a wonderful session that was sponsored by the Department of Health. And so, first, before we even get started at talking about race and trauma, I really want to talk about what is race and where did race come from. When we consider what race is, it's important for us to recognize that it is a construct created by people who decided especially it really actually started during the Enlightenment period, believe it or not. So when we were starting to look at the world in a different way, certain thinkers started to propose dividing the world into kind of four races. And these were mainly kind of a biological taxonomy by observation of people and what they were associating certain moral and emotional behaviors with these four classifications. And so it's really interesting. Since then, there had not been really any kind of uh, further work done. It really kind of got stuck in that space of classifying people according to biological traits. But by the 70s, lots of research in anthropology as well as genetics really kind of undid this concept of the biological notion of race. In other words, race really doesn't exist in the way that we have always been told it does, in the way that we have understood it. There is no true difference in people biologically, as many would have us believe. What has been found is that really the differences are truly cultural. And so when we start to understand this and we look at how race has been used to classify people, and even in our history, in the most recent 300 years, we have understood race to be a classifier. Many of us classify ourselves according to race. And so understanding that race is truly something that, according to science, has been unwritten, yet it is still used today is really interesting. And so, even recently, in the last 3 years, there have been publications that have sought to kind of reinvigorate this concept of race as something that establishes a genomic supremacy, really, for certain people, for the European classes, or in other words, people who are considered white. But it really is more of a look at eugenics, which was something that was popularized, especially during the World War II German Third Reich. And so last year, as a matter of fact, the National Academies of Science responded to all of these and warned researchers to really look at how they are justifying any use of race or ancestry categories, because they say these these categories really serve to reinforce inequity instead of eliminating it. But let's look at how race relations have played out here in our state in Louisiana. So, for those of you who already are very familiar with our history, I will make this brief, but I think it's important for us to re examine where we have come in the last few hundred years in our country and in our state. We know that the first slave ships from Africa arrived a year after New Orleans was founded. And what we know was that the number of slaves by 1741, really only almost 25 years later, we know that for every four African slaves, there were 1.2 free white persons in Louisiana. Now, as more and more people came to this state and to our region, the ratio had balanced out to about 4.6 slaves for every 3.7 white people. So although the discrepancy wasn't as huge, there was still a majority of enslaved Black persons. And this existed, this majority existed for a long, long time. Um, and so 1724 was when Louisiana established a Code Noir. The Code Noir that had been established by Louis XIV initially had kind of, once the French Revolution happened and once there was no longer French colonial rule, those rules kind of moved along. But Louisiana actually reestablished a Code Noir themselves to say, this is what we need to do. We need to look at how slavery is regulated in the colonial Louisiana, and slaves were at that time required to become Catholic and were, given certain what they were calling privileges, such as mothers were not sold without their children. They were not separated at the time. They were given food and clothing. And however, we know that slaves certainly did not have rights and were prohibited from owning property, from testifying against white persons. And that's important for us to recognize as well. 130 years later, though, basically there were about 331,000 slaves in Louisiana. And then after the post-Civil War, so this is when, as we know, the Civil War really was looking at how enslaved persons were a necessity for the economy. However, the North had said, this is not going to be the case. And so what we know is that after the Civil War, groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, which actually came out of Tennessee, and the White League, which was a group that was established here in Louisiana, and a number of the Confederate veterans massacred Black people across the state in New Orleans, in Thibodaux, in Opelousas, Colfax, in St. Bernard Parish. And at that time, in that period, there were almost 400 lynchings that took place of Black persons in Louisiana. And then in the 1870s, Jim Crow laws really codified segregation and established that belief of white supremacy and the need to separate Black persons and white persons. And that was an important, obviously, moment in our history, but we recognize how much opposition there was to these laws. And as the times progressed, we know that there was a lot of pushback and a lot of protest and bravery that took place of persons saying, no, we won't abide by these laws, and we will start to look at how we can identify our own, personhood in this world, in this new world. And so in 1953, actually, in Baton Rouge, that was the first bus boycott, not the famous Montgomery bus boycott, which happened several years later. That was important for us to recognize because the movement really started here. And in 1954, we know that Brown versus Board of Education, decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, said that we will not segregate our schools anymore. And here in Louisiana, we had our very own Ruby Bridges, who lives today at the age of 78. At age 6, she was sent in with a number of federal protections. She was escorted by federal marshals through hostile white crowds. And what ended up happening was that she was the only child in the school. And for the rest of the school year, she remained the only child in the school. All of the parents withdrew their white children from the school and refused to send their children there. And it wasn't until 1960 when Judge Skelly Wright ruled that the first grade classrooms were finally ordered to integrate. And even then, only a handful of Black children were admitted. So we know that while Ruby and her teacher spent the whole year alone, symbols of both courage and isolation in the face of systemic racism, she experienced more than her story of individual bravery. And I have to say, it's important for us to recognize that while Ruby Bridges and these children were the ones who were sent into the schools, uh, really all of this segregation was placed on these children's shoulders. And so I think it's really important to recognize the trauma that these children experienced and the kind of this institutional resistance to equity that really helped sustain all of these broader systems of exclusion that exist today, that continue today. And so it's important for us to recognize that across all of these generations, all of these actions continue to shape the racial inequities that exist today in health, in access, and in opportunity across our state. When we look at neighborhoods that were primarily and historically Black, successful neighborhoods, such as the Claiborne Avenue neighborhood in New Orleans, which for years had been a center of economic and cultural wellness for Black persons, in the late 1960s, an infrastructure initiative basically mowed down all of the oak trees that were on the beautiful avenue, uh, and replaced them with a huge bridge that went through and really decimated what was a booming and thriving uh, Black uh, neighborhood of economic well-being. Let's look at poverty across our state. So we look at poverty by race in Louisiana. We know that uh, still 30% of the people who live in poverty in our state are Black, followed by 21% Hispanic and 12% white. When we look at the poverty rates for people across the entire state, we can see that there are 9 parishes that really stand up as those who are the greatest, have the greatest poverty. And of those many, even 5 of those are even above what is the Louisiana poverty rate, which is 21%. So when we look at this and look at the poverty rates for all ages compared across the state, look at how little it has changed for Black persons in Louisiana. I think that's important for us to recognize. So the shift has not really caught up with people who are identified as Black. What we are talking about is basically the resulting inequities. And we know that even last year, Louisiana ranks worse than average for racial, ethnic, health disparities. When we look at the concept of the school to prison pipeline, which I think is an important one for us to understand because that definitely touches on perceptions, it touches on bias, is that in Louisiana, rates of suspension and expulsion were as high as 44%. I mean, as high as 72% for expulsions and 66% of suspensions for Black students, even though Black students really comprise only 44% of the total school population of the students. And what we also know then is that Black students receive referrals to law enforcement or school-related arrest programs twice as much as white students. And it's important for us to understand that in the United States, there are schools that have police but don't have counselors. There are schools that have police but don't have nurses. Schools that have police but don't have school psychologists or social workers. And so the impact of policing our students as opposed to supporting our students and supporting their well-being, their mental health is important for us to understand. And so when we start to look at the impact of trauma and look at our incarceration trends, what this shows is that on the left, you can see that males comprise most of the incarcerated persons in Louisiana from since 2012 all the way to this year. 94%, 95%, 94% are males. But then when we look at the racial breakdown, still approximately 65%. So it was 68 in 2012. It is now approximately 65% of persons that are incarcerated are still Black. Then the categories go to others, and then white only is like 0.5%. And that has held steady since 2012. And that's important for us to recognize. And so shifting the conversation to trauma, kind of giving you this background of where we've come, where we've been, where we are, it's important for us to understand that trauma is defined as a sudden and potentially deadly experience, at least even the perception of lethality, often leaving lasting and troubling memories. And it can affect the way that we believe and see our future, right? When we experience trauma, we also experience a loss of hope. We begin to have limited expectations about what is possible in our lives. We begin to fear that life could end abruptly or early, and that we anticipate that a normal life or that normal events won't occur for us, that they only happen for other people. And this is important for us to really understand. When we look at racial trauma, there's actually a term for this. It's called race-based traumatic stress. It is not a mental health disorder. It is more of an emotional injury, a mental injury that takes place, and it's caused by encounters with racism, encounters with racial bias, ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. And so any person who has experienced an emotionally painful or sudden or uncontrollable racist encounter is subject to experiencing this race-based traumatic stress. And in our country, BIPOC are most vulnerable. BIPOC meaning Black, Indigenous, and persons of color are really the most vulnerable, especially related to the historic and systemic oppression that we've already delineated that exists. And our race-based discrimination, it can impact both people and communities. And these incidents, especially if they are prolonged incidents, can lead to PTSD-like symptoms. And so when we look at how this presents, it presents as anger, it presents as perseverance of negative thinking. It is a physical reaction, such as, physical illness can be anything from headaches to chest pain to insomnia to GI symptoms. There are many impacts of the physical realm. There may be hypervigilance or low self-esteem and mental distancing from the trauma, where people want to just kind of seek to not feel this trauma. And so it is important for us to recognize that persons who experience this mental injury, it really takes place in a space of systemic racism or people who are experiencing racist events. So when we look at kind of what historical trauma does, because we've talked about the different historical traumas that we've experienced in our state in Louisiana, everything from the loss of language and culture and family uh, during the Atlantic slave trade. So that was, being torn away from a home country and being brought to a place and then being forced into a certain religion and being forced into certain norms that really don't have anything to do with your own culture. So losing that is traumatic. Then, of course, Jim Crow, codifying oppression, traumatic. Katrina, in the way that it impacted disproportionately persons of color in our region, mass incarceration that we've discussed, and racialized violence. All of these things, these histories of traumatic events really create those traumatic stress reactions that we were talking about. And then those traumatic stressors increase our risk for substance abuse and dependence, increased vulnerability of suicidality and mental disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and then certainly our increased risk of experiencing other traumas. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why that is so. But if you are a person who's already experienced a lot of traumas in your life, you are more prone to experience further traumas. And the reason for this really kind of ties into this concept of adverse childhood experiences. So before I go on, I'm very interested in knowing if people are familiar with this concept of adverse childhood experiences and this study that was done in 1999 that kind of really brought these to light and their impact on persons. So I see a thumbs up. Anyone else? I don't see any comments. So good. So a number of you are familiar with this concept. Thank you. This study, great. So thank you so much. So I see that a number of you are familiar, and I can't see the comments in the chat. If anyone would be willing to share those, that would be great. Um,
There's some comments that people are familiar.
Fantastic. Thank you. So great. I'm seeing lots of thumbs up and people being familiar. In the event there are persons that are not, I just want to let you know that these adverse childhood experiences are those that take place between the ages of 0 and 18. And they are in three categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. In the abuse category, we have physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. In the neglect category, there's both physical and emotional neglect. And then in the household dysfunction category, there's mental illness. So, was there a person with mental illness in the household? Is there an incarcerated relative? Was the mother treated violently, or was there interpersonal strain in the household? Was there a lot of fighting and yelling and danger? Was there substance abuse in the household, or was there a divorce? So I imagine that looking at these categories, any number of us would have experienced possibly one, if not more than one of these, but they are more common than you would want to think. And so when we're looking at the impacts of these adverse childhood experiences, and I just want to also say, if any of this is in any way triggering, I apologize. I want you to make sure that you take good care of yourself in this moment. And if there are things that you have not resolved, I encourage you to receive the support that you need to come to terms with and to heal those things inside that feel hard. So when we look at the data on ACEs by race, what we found was that the number of persons with ACEs in the US on average, 0 ACEs, 55% of persons in the US. In Louisiana, it was less, 48% of just having one ACE. Of having no ACEs. Of one ACE, it's a little higher in Louisiana. Of having two ACEs, it's even higher. And 3 to 8 ACEs, it increases by 4 percentage points in Louisiana. We do not have the highest rates recorded in our country. We also are not testing and studying adverse childhood experiences consistently in Louisiana. It is something that is part of a national survey of children's health, and it is not consistently a question that is asked in our state. But what we know is that disproportionately across the United States, uh, Latino and Black children experience ACEs at a higher rate than white children. And when we look at these kind of concepts of the adverse childhood experiences, which we've already discussed on the top, there is an additional level that was considered by Ellis and Dietz in 2017, saying that adverse community environments also impact the child, the developing child. So that would be poverty, discrimination, any kind of community disruption or lack of feeling of safety, violence, poor housing quality and affordability, and lack of opportunity or economic mobility and social capital. These are both ACEs that we need to understand in the context of the people that we serve. So when we look at the impact of ACEs, the more ACEs that a person experiences, so like we said, in Louisiana, 48% have no ACEs. But as we increase, 14% of our population, which I honestly believe is much higher, have a rate of 4 or more ACEs. So what does that do? Once you have a rate of 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, what does that do to the person? I want you to consider a child living in an environment where there are 4 or more negative experiences that they're impacting in their household. And imagine the amount of cortisol and stress hormones that this child is dumping. They're always looking to survival. They're always trying to survive, to make it through the day, to maybe help their siblings make it through the day. A lot of times they have huge obligations to their siblings, or at least they feel they do. They have huge sense of obligation to their household. A lot of these children are just trying to keep the peace, trying to not rock the boat, and trying to make sure that everything is safe and quiet if possible for just that day. And so when we look at the longer term impact of ACEs, this came from the Centers for Disease Control. It's no longer available on their site, but I luckily downloaded it in 2023. It is the mechanism by which these experiences really shorten our lifespan. So when we look at the adverse childhood experiences, then there's a disrupted neurodevelopment because of all of those stress hormones that are dumping. So while the child is supposed to be building that sense of safety and security, if you remember the different levels of kind of development, social, emotional development that children are supposed to be experiencing in early childhood, those things aren't happening. It's disrupted. And so that really disrupts you neurobiologically. And that leads to social and emotional and cognitive impairments. People do not function the same in society as persons who did not have all of these adverse childhood experiences. And so there is a greater likelihood of adopting high risk behaviors, such as smoking, overeating, injectable drug use, or just drug use in general. So it's important for us to recognize that these kind of adopting these unhealthy behaviors lead to disease, disability, and certainly social problems and early death. When I think about the face of this, of the long-term impact of adverse childhood experiences, I think of a woman named Tonier Kane. Tonier Kane is famous for a documentary she made called Healing Neen, Neen, which was the name her mother gave her. And she grew up in a very dysfunctional household, and she tells her story through a series of pictures. The first picture is of herself as a little girl with plaits in her hair, smiling. And then the pictures of her subsequent mugshots and arrests. She had over 80 arrests, over 60 convictions for everything from soliciting, uh, distributing drugs, sex work, and any number of crimes. This young woman, as a matter of fact, lived under a bridge. And there's a part where she talks about how when she was living under the bridge, she felt safer than she ever did anywhere else. Understanding also that the impact of intergenerational trauma and epigenetics is another component of this layering of the impact of traumas, that we recognize that there is an impact of genetic impact of parents who've experienced traumas that is passed down to the child. So mothers who were, the study that showed mothers who were exposed to the Holocaust showed changes in the activity of a certain DNA segment involving the regulation of stress responses. And so genetically, persons can be altered. And so their children who were not directly exposed showed these changes as well. Higher rates of depression, higher rates of chronic depression, and women who experience severe child abuse compared with children of mothers who didn't experience such abuse. And so another concept that we need to understand is the intersectionality of being BIPOC and intersecting with other identities, such as being non-cisgender, having a LGBTQ plus sexual orientation, disability, housing insecurity, or being unhoused and being disadvantaged socioeconomically. And what we know is that we see this impact through less access, being isolated more in society or self-isolation. And it really heightens persons' vulnerability of being more marginalized, more othered, more excluded in society than persons who do not have this intersectionality. So I want to just take a breath because I have been sharing a lot of information that feels really hard. And so I want you to take a moment and recognize that I think it's important for us to look at these hard things, but it is also important for us to see that there is hope, that there is us, because just by talking about the hard things, we didn't make them happen. We didn't speak them into existence. They are there in the daily lives of many of the people that we serve. And so the hopeful part is that there is work to be done and that there is work that we can do. So as people working in healthcare, we can certainly intervene to disrupt this long-term harm. And that is through really, when we think about being innovative, truly innovative, it is looking at the solution to a problem in a way that we don't currently. So our problems of high heart disease, high rates of hypertension, high rates of diabetes, high rates of smoking and unhealthy behaviors, instead of looking at just what we believe may be genetic causes, perhaps we need to look at other causes such as lifelong trauma and provide care that is trauma informed. So when we are providing care, let's enhance the care, the primary care that we provide by considering the trauma that people have experienced and providing more victim-centered approaches and treatment to lessen the harm of adverse childhood experiences, because healing is possible. When I tell that story about Tony or Kane, it wasn't until someone, instead of saying, "What is wrong with you?" they said, "What happened to you?" that her healing began. And she is now a speaker, an advocate, and really an amazing kind of truth teller about the issues related to the impact of ACEs, as well as a hope giver for those who've experienced them. She goes into women's prisons, she talks with women, and she helps them begin their healing journey. And then there are PACEs, which I will talk about. So besides ACEs, there are PACEs, which are preventive things that we can look at, and treatment to prevent problem behavior and future involvement in violence. And then family-centered treatment for substance abuse and mental health disorders and all of those things that are plaguing so many of the people that we serve. So PACEs, an amazing study that was done most recently in I believe it was done in 2017, But what the beginning of this work really showed was that there is a protective means of providing support to people who have potentially experienced or have actually experienced adverse childhood experiences. So, parenting, caregiver, unconditional love, and spending time with a best friend, for that child to spend time with a friend, for them to help others is helpful as well. Being active in a social group and feeling acceptance and community, having someone who is seen as a mentor to them outside of their family, or even someone who is outside of their immediate family, may be in the family, like a loving grandmother or a loving cousin, which was in the case of Tony Arcane. He had a cousin who, when she was taken for the first time from her family to by CPS, he was sent to her cousin's house, and her cousin was so loving, and she taught her hygiene, and she taught her how to clean herself, and she taught her how to brush her own teeth and fix her hair, and really all the things that she had never learned at home. And she just affirmed her with patience and love. Having a clean and safe home with enough food, having opportunities to learn and to grow, having a hobby or an interest, or being active in playing sports, or having routines at home or fair rules. These are all things that prevent adverse childhood experiences. And so, as we parent and we support parents who are providing care to children, it's important for these kind of 10 cases to be considered for every child in every household. And the impact of PACEs is tremendous. They actually found that a dose response association between positive childhood experience really impacted kids in having healthier relationships, better social, emotional, cognitive functioning, healthier relationships, healthier behaviors. We can also turn to allyship, which is a never ending commitment. It is our ethical duty, really, to be intentional in the way that we share the work that we're doing. Um, we know that Carl Rogers was one who spoke of unconditional positive regard and restored hope in showing us that we are loved just by allowing people to be who they are and not judging them. And so, not judging our patients, but listening to them. And that each of us has that opportunity to really be present and give empathy and support and acceptance to the people that we serve. I want to thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much. I apologize for the glitch with my sharing, and I hope that the information was helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Rooney, and giving us this reflection. And the getting the start from the beginning and early childhood is so important, and it really impacts who we're caring for and the impact that we can help make on their life. So thank you so much.